tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. So we've been talking about craving and dukkha, the relationship between the first and second noble truths, getting grounded in foundations here. And then this past week, as I was writing the little email newsletter, I wanted to write about being with the intensity of the moment that we're in, and particularly the practice of reading the news and how we are with encountering the larger world. And that this is in some ways things like this, like how we relate to the world around us. I want us to use these teachings on craving, like craving, because it means so much more than just what do I want, but it's really how am I unconsciously connected to, particularly unhealthily connected to things that are happening? What are the ways that my connections to what's happening are not serving me, right? So craving or thirst, tanha, second noble truth, is a way of talking about the ways that we get stuck, fixated, concepts get reified, habits get solidified, calcified, in ways that aren't healthy, that aren't helpful, right? So not all of that feels like wanting. Some of it can feel like identity, some of it can feel like habit, some of it can feel like addiction, some of it can feel like culture, like just how we are with the things of the world around us. And so, thinking about the intensity of the global situation, one of the things we can reflect on is not just that the global situation is intense, which it is, that there's so much happening. We might be tracking, tracking authoritarian actions in our own country. We're tracking, Minneapolis, and, uh, violence and terror there. It's ongoing, maybe backing off slightly, but we don't actually know. It definitely is, folks are still there, folks are still resisting. Yeah, and so many things, like one week Gaza is front of news, one week Ukraine is front of news, one week, you know, um, a marvelous Super Bowl halftime performance by my compatriot, um, uh, Bad Bunny is in the news. Blessings to him and uh, everyone who shakes their booty in response to um, good music like that. But also, everyone who cares about the colonial process and oppression and history and occupation and, capitalism and sugar and monopoly and power, gender, and force, and, everything. Like the news cycle is this cornucopia of activation, of force, of compelling stories, many of which are terrible, some of which are beautiful, all of which pull on attention in this kind of constant way. And how could we think about this? So, one way we can think about this is that our nervous system and our attention is created with the purpose of keeping us safe, and one of its habits then is to be drawn to the most intense or loudest, most prominent stimulus in the sensory field. And so, of course, you know, uh, like the horrible news sells more papers than the good news. It's louder, it's more terrifying, it's more compelling, it gets more clicks, it gets more eyeballs. And so, in our relating to the media ecosystem, is already this way where our habits of craving, unconscious, being drawn to intensity, are being used, co-opted, abused by those interested in showing us advertising, essentially, you know. But even to not make it nefarious, are being used by folks who sincerely want to keep us informed in the interests of democracy and human rights and well-being. Like, I think of journalism as essentially a good thing in a functioning culture. Um, and and it's obsessive and moves too fast and sells advertising and all the things. But we have this one way where we could think about, resisting craving as resisting the autonomic impulse of our attention to get stuck to whatever flashy, shiny thing is placed in front of us. And partly uh, to do that, we need to cultivate the renunciation to not have it right in front of us, to not just constantly have the screen on or the thing playing. Because at this point in the media ecosystem, it's democratized enough and globalized enough and 24/7 enough that you can never actually do what, like when I was growing up, what the adults would do, which is finish the morning paper and then throw it out. And then there's no more news, you know, until at least the nighttime. So like my parents would read the morning newspaper in print with black newsprint all over their fingers over breakfast, and then watch, the evening news at 10. And in between that, there was no news, unless something really dire happened and we all had to run to the radio. Um, but now, in between every task, every text, every email, you could check the news. Some days I do. And I can feel how the omnipresence of that stimulus, even when it's not on, pulls on my attention a little bit. I could always check the news. And it doesn't have to be news. Like news is sort of the thing that hooks me the most. Um, but it could be other things. For some of us, the omnipresence of like a library of an enormous amount of music is that you could always turn on Spotify or whatever you use, to have a constant flow of sound. you know and again, I remember when I got my first, uh, I remember I had a collection of vinyl for a while. When I was actually really young, we had a collection of 8-track tapes. I remember those. um, how like every 15 minutes or something they would click clunk as they went to the next little section of the tape. And then we had a library of vinyl, and then eventually I got CDs when I was a teenager. But there was always this sense of like I only owned so many. You listen to them and then they're done. But again, now we're in this like infinite stream. And what does that do to craving, to the craving heart, to the mind that could always turn toward a shiny sensory experience, a new shiny sensory experience? It's like we've banished boredom. We've banished empty space. We've banished silence. We've banished, you know, a non-shiny visual field because you can always uh, have a shinier visual field. Adults like grumble about teens like looking at their phones all the time rather than just sitting at the bus stop and appreciating the trees or, whatever. Um, but if you just think about us as animals, and, you know, a shiny moving image is going to be more compelling to the attention than a more static, dull image. And the light and the speed and the sound of the images on the phone is just going to be more compelling to the nervous system, in a habitual way than the the duller image around. And I'm saying duller just in terms of intensity, really. Part of our training is to learn how to shift our attention into both seeing the immediate environment as not dull, like getting interested again in trees and bird song and the shimmer of rain on leaves, But even, even the shimmer of oil in an oil slick on the street, like being present with the realness of the meat world is a training to appreciate that, to appreciate silence and less stimulation. And it can be trained. And, for a little anecdote, my partner right now is teaching the teen mindfulness series at Spirit Rock, which they do regularly. And so she and her co-teacher, another friend of ours, are with, a couple dozen teenagers, 14 to 19-year-olds, every week. And they do basic mindfulness and emotional intelligence stuff and share with each other. And it's beautiful, beautiful work for that age group. It's a beautiful offering that the teens get a ton out of it. And when you know, um, they share, really from the heart in this very fresh way. And I'll report without knowing names because I don't know any of their names, but I'll report secondhand that this past week's teen sangha included teens saying things like, um, you know, oh, I had 5 minutes, you know, to kill, but while I was waiting for my friend or something. And I would usually just pull out my phone, but instead I didn't. And I just sat there and like everything was just so quiet and peaceful and the world looked so beautiful. And I suddenly felt so good. And they're like reporting this like it's an epiphany, and which it is, right? And and we should know it as such, right? And and so part of our training is on the renunciate side to actually figure out how to give ourselves a break from this obsessive, unconscious stimulation. And then on the wisdom side, so that the renunciate side is a little bit like concentration practice, right? You just insist on not getting lost in the thing, right? You turn off, you put down the phone, you turn off that, you close the app. Um, I have a little thing I do sometimes when I'm on like a social media site particularly, but also sometimes reading the news or sort of scrolling around or reading something. I'll notice after I've been on for a little while that my attention is starting to be like, oh, I'm not completely enjoying this, but I'll feel the pull to click on one more thing. And and often when I'm on those kind of sites, if I'm on the computer, which I usually am, not so much the phone for me, but I'm usually on the computer, and I will let my left hand kind of just hover near the the keyboard or wherever it is. It's resting wherever it is. But I'll do this thing where I'll have a moment of noticing, oh, I'm on this, I've been on long enough, it's not interesting anymore, even though I feel the impulse to click on the next thing. And before I can click on the next thing, my left hand will jump in and Command W to close the tab. And it's like, it's like a little just like wake up. And as soon as I sort of wake up from the trance of it, I just close the tab before I have a chance to be like, um, but wait, you know, Harry Styles has said something in public. I must know, whatever, right? Something's happening with the Epstein files. And like Control W, you know, um, Command W. Just get out of there. Get out. And so there's a little renunciate training that we can do. And you can make up whatever it is for you. But renunciation is a little bit like when I'm in meditation, I notice the mind wandering and it wants to fantasize about something, think about something, it's planning, it's doing whatever it does. Mindfulness has to come in with enough strength to command W out of the fantasy, to snap out of it, whatever it is. And sometimes there is mindfulness. There's enough awareness to be like, oh yeah, my mind's really wandering a lot today, but it doesn't come forward with enough force to really change my state. And what I need is a mindfulness that's strong enough to assess, is this really what I want to be doing right now? And if not, can I get out? Right? And it's really the difference between, being like, oh my God, I walked into this bar with my friends again, but I really don't want to drink and I don't actually even want to be in the bar and it's not really pleasant. There's a difference between kind of noticing that and sort of floating along with it and being like, wait a minute, you know, hey guys, this isn't really my jam. I'll see you tomorrow, and just walking out. So there's a renunciate side. How do we snap out of it? There's a wisdom side to it. And this is a bit what I was writing about this past week. I've talked about some of this before. We talked about this a bit last year. Um, when the Buddha found his liberation, finally, at the end of all that searching, um, he finds it in the form of three cascading visions. And the Buddha's core supernatural or just talent, let's say, not supernatural, but super trained natural skill is with inner vision. He's a clairvoyant. So the thing he can do that's super is not like Jesus who heals people physically. Um, the Buddha sees people at a distance. So people keep coming to him and they say, such and such person just died. Where has he gone on to? And the Buddha extends his inner eye and says, oh, he's gone on to this heaven realm or that hell realm or that ghost realm or be reborn in this or that place. So he does a lot of predicting of what's going on with people after they die, but he also just sees what's happening at a distance. So like there's a moment when this rich donor is giving a big gift of dana to Sariputta and Mahamoggallana, many, many kilometers away from where the Buddha is staying. And the Buddha, with his inner vision, kind of gets an intuition that this awesome dana gift is happening far away and he approves from where he is, right? So it's not just dead people that he sees, but he can reach out and see, what's going on in other places. And so when I reflect on this, I'm like, okay, so he's got clairvoyance. If if we take that literally, and there's reasons why we shouldn't, but let's say we do, and we say if he chooses to, he could, like eavesdrop on things happening in other parts of the world. I was like, okay, so we know some of what was going on in other parts of the world at the time of the Buddha. Like there were all these wars between the Greeks and the Persians, for instance, you know, um, or Socrates is teaching, or, Confucius is teaching, like all these awesome people who are alive at the same time, but in faraway places. Um, or there's like a whole bunch of wars in, what we now call Oaxaca as the Zapotec Empire is coming into power. Um, of course, it never says in the Pali Canon that the Buddha extends his inner sight and notices, the empires of the Greeks or the Chinese or the, Zapotecans doing their thing. But let's say that he could, you know, do that. And even within the context that we do hear about him talking, where he knows, what wars are going on near him in various kingdoms, and he knows how people are being born, and some people are being born in hell realms, and there's bandits in this or that place, and it's violent in this or that place. He has awareness of more horror and pain and suffering going on in the world than is in his immediate location. And what's that like, to be aware of pain and suffering for people toward people who are distant from you? And I'm thinking about this because I think that one of the things that can be so challenging in our contemporary moment is the extraordinary reach of our digital clairvoyance at the moment. It's really a very new thing in human history that, I can just look up right now what's going on in, you know, I don't know what's going on in Ukraine, what's going on in Mali, what's going on in Uganda? What's going on in Venezuela? Not just the headline places. Like I sort of know what's going on. I know a couple of tiny details about terrible things going on in a few places. But that if I really dig, I could find a local paper, in Burkina Faso and be like, what's going on, you know, in this place? And I could read that. Somebody would if I would find Google would translate it for me. Like this is absurd, really, for the human nervous system, for my human nervous system, that, if we believe um, some of the folks who think about these things, was really evolved to track, let's say, a few hundred people in relationships. And I can just sort of reach out my mind and be like, tell me about, social conflict in Hong Kong right now. And I could just, oh, look, Jimmy Lai is going back into prison. And like, what does it do to my nervous system, my sense of well-being, my sense of identity, my heart, really, that I'm this clairvoyant? And I called this clairvoyance without equanimity. Like if I imagine that the Buddha can eavesdrop on all these wars all over the world, and there's always so much horror happening, that if we knew about it, you know, would we not just be overwhelmed, heartbroken, you know, as many of us can feel nowadays? And I say, okay, well, if the Buddha could do this, he's not overwhelmed and heartbroken because he understands the world. And he understands it because this is exactly the vision that he gets that we call his awakening, right? He has three visions on the night of his awakening. The first is the vision into rebirth. So he sees his own past births way back through multiple universes, so gazillions of lifetimes. And there's the sense of just being present with all of it. And without getting into the weeds about like who it is that's reborn or what it means for it to be his rebirths, one way we could understand this is, what would it be like if we could have a personal, visceral memory of generation after generation after generation, worlds after worlds, universes after universes, of beings being born and dying, right? Living, longing, loving, suffering, losing, dying, over and over and over again in this countless, sort of endless profusion of birth and death and everything in between. What would that do to you if you could remember having participated in that forever up till now? Right? That's the first insight is he remembers the past all the way back. And there's no beginning to it. So it's just, he says it's inconceivably beginningless. The second insight is the insight into others. So the first insight is framed in the sense of the personal. I remembered my past lives. The second is framed in the second person, third person. He saw beings passing away and reappearing in accordance with their actions. So he sees how karma works, how karma works. And this is the sense of looking out into the world and seeing like, yeah, here's everything that's happening. And again, we've already touched into the infinite past. So here's everything happening, and it's been happening, for everyone. Like there's this quality of being conscious life, sentient life, knowing the experience of pain and loss and wanting and loving and attainment and loss again and again and again. And he says, oh, this happens to everybody. And the reason it keeps happening, the reason that consciousness keeps being connected to this birthing and deathing living process is it's connected by wanting. It's connected by this craving thing. And so, that's what keeps it all going. And having seen these two things, the infinite past and how he can remember it, and the infinite play of birth and death based on craving that everyone is in, the third insight is to uproot participation with that any longer, right? And it's not even a rejection of it. It's really like suddenly you wake up from having seen so many movies, so many stories, and you just don't need to see any more movies, right? Like you've heard so much music, you just don't need to hear any more music, even though music is beautiful, right? It's just not, you don't need it. He doesn't need it anymore. Not needing something is the end of craving. That's the third noble truth, right? Cessation. The cessation and fading away and final ending of this very same craving is the end of suffering. To stop craving is to not need something anymore. And how do we get to that? So the Buddha gets to that, and it is because he has touched this no longer needing anything from the world anymore. This is how he can be so deeply clairvoyant and not overwhelmed, not suffer on the basis of it. He's compassionate, right? Like he can clearly see, and all of the those who realize the Dhamma, I think this is why compassion really comes to the foreground as the quintessential emotion of awakened beings in the Dhamma, is because the thing you see when you really understand the past and you understand time and experience so deeply, the thing that you see is how painful it is that people keep, repeating the same, uh, patterns again and again and again without really learning. And there's just so much, suffering and despair because of this, it's like the Buddha's in a bar and he he not only loses his desire to drink, but he becomes like radically sober, like wildly clear in his mind, and doesn't need to alter his mind state in any way. There's no attraction to anything that the bar has to offer. And then he's just still, but he's still alive, right? He's a teacher. And he just starts to quietly tell, whoever's in the bar who he thinks will listen. Right after his awakening, he says, who could I teach? Who could I tell this to who would get it? Because this is clearly pretty subtle and nobody's going to understand. And he thinks about his first two teachers, Alara Kalama and Udaka Ramaputta. And he says they were really close. They would understand. And he extends his clairvoyance out, and they've both recently died. Right. Um, there's a really poignant story from the Buddha's birth. Right after he's born, this sage comes, a sage named Asita, to give him his kind of prediction. And he sees the baby and he just starts to weep, to really cry. And the Buddha's dad, Suddhodana, says, why are you crying? Is there some bad omen? Is the child cursed in some way? And Asita says, no, no. The child is so blessed. He's going to be an amazing teacher. He will liberate so many. And I am so old. I will die before he starts teaching. He's weeping for himself that he won't get to study with the Buddha. He's not going to last long enough. Right? So the thing the Buddha has to go along with his awesome power of the inner eye is he has this extraordinary equanimity. He can see everything happening and he has compassion for it, but he's seen so much, right? All of these countless universes arising and passing, that he can see all of it and not be lost in it. But here we are with this like sort of, tech-enabled clairvoyance. And I totally don't have that equanimity. I read the news of, name any place. And if I read it with my heart not closed, it's just rending. It can be crushing. It can be so overwhelming. And I think what I mostly want, because I don't have the Buddha's equanimity, is I want to take in only what I can digest. And when it's really heartrending, I want to actually feel that. I want to slow down with the story of, starving children in this place, or abused children in this place, or people freezing through a winter, or abused by the evil powerful in this place. I want to slow down and feel what I'm reading, right? So that I'm not lost in a fog of, you know, just kind of skating over the shiny surface of things. And if it's all too overwhelming and I can't actually engage like that, then I want the discipline to set it down, because it's not, I think it's not actually useful to us. Even though it feels useful to say, like, I'm staying informed, I don't think it's actually useful to be emotionally, energetically overwhelmed. And so I want to tend and shepherd my own state so that when I engage, I'm doing so from the most consolidated, uh, grounded place that I can. And I just think that this is more helpful for myself, for others. Even after the Buddha was enlightened, he said, life in the city is dusty, chaotic, noisy. But out here in the wilderness, it's peaceful, calm, it's quiet. And one of his monks, um, who used to be a king, was overheard in his kuti, in his meditation, saying, "What bliss, what bliss." And the monks, his fellow monks, said, "Oh, he must be remembering his hedonistic life as a king." And they brought him to the Buddha and they said, "This monk is just fantasizing about his wealthy life as a king." And the Buddha says, "Is it true, monk, that you are saying, 'What bliss, what bliss'?" And the monk says, "Yes, Lord, it's true." And the Buddha says, "Why are you saying this?" And the monk says, "Because when I was a king, it was all stress and busyness and dangerous, and I had guards posted inside and outside the palace, and I was worried for my life. But now, out here in the forest, owning nothing, responsible to no one, uh, with no stress and no danger, I live at ease with my mind like a wild deer. And it is because of this that I say, 'What bliss, what bliss.'" So that's the renunciate side. I think what we are invited to do with the awesome power of our clairvoyance is to engage with the world in such a way as to nurture our empathy and our compassion and our impulse to do good for the world as best we can, but to be aware of the forces of uh, fixation and craving that would capture our attention uh, in a way that can only lead to overwhelm and a kind of dullness of spirit, and isn't good, I think, for ourselves or the world. So, all right. So the inner firewall of the mind, the heart, keep it strong. Uh, all right, pausing there. Thank you so much.